Well, good evening to our viewers here in Denmark, and we're very glad that you're with us. And especially, it's not good evening to you because you're in another time zone, but hello to you in the US, Bhaskar.
Hi, how are you? Thanks
We're
for doing this. I'm looking forward to it.
And thank you very much for taking your time on the last full day of the Trump presidency to talk to us.
Yeah, it's a day of celebration for those on my side of the political spectrum. But we'll see what kind of damage he could do in the next 11 hours or so.
Well, I first want to ask you about this attack on Capitol Hill, because when you see it from abroad, my sensation is that Americans are overreacting a little bit. When you see it, when you're not part of it, and when you're not, I understand it must be a horrifying event for those inside the Capitol building, and especially those that were in danger. And I understand that it must be horrible to look at, and symbolically, it's a horrendous event. But I'm a little surprised by the reaction, people referring to it as a coup, as if they were really imagining that they would take the levers of power and take over control of the state apparatus. And I've been surprised by the reactions from someone on the left, like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I'm surprised that the one that I find most reasonable has actually been Joe Biden. There's been a surprise.
Yes. Well, I think that it's not just those on the left of the Democratic Party, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who use the word coup in that narrative, but it's actually the mainstream of American liberalism, particularly the mainstream media has used that language. And you would think that given America's very long experience conducting coups in other countries, that the American media would be very familiar with the concept of a coup. Yes, I agree that the language is completely hyperbolic. I think that we're seeing a lot of hyperbole in American civil society at the moment, just in general. There has been fueled panics created by both center-left and right-of-center media about a host of issues. It becomes very difficult to have a rational debate and then discuss things. And obviously, I think what happened on Capitol Hill was a disgrace. It was a violent riot by right-wing Trump supporters. It desecrated the Capitol. It was a direct attack on American democratic norms. And I am a person of the radical left, but I'd rather have a stable, functioning bourgeois democracy than no democracy at all. So certainly, I think that it was a threat and it was disgraceful. And certainly, these people want to inflict harm not just on left-wing Democratic Party figures, but also on figures like Mitch McConnell, like Vice President Pence, and others that they thought were not fulfilling Trump's mandate. But yes, I think there's a big difference between the actions of a mob and the actions of an organized coup. And it does us no favors to conflate the two.
Well, let's focus on what's happening tomorrow, because on the one hand, we'll see under the slogan of America United, we'll see Joe Biden walking with the Obamas and the Clintons and the Bushes even, and those dreaming of a new beginning in America would see like the old neoliberal regime of 30 years of neoliberal policies. And we would think that that's the Biden narrative, restore the soul of the nation. And Trump was just an aberration. Let's go back to the world as it was before 2015 and 16. On the other hand, when you look at Biden's policies, there are some very radical elements in it. And he's obviously also influenced by Bernie Sanders, and he has this proposal for a $15 minimum wage, something that Hillary Clinton ridiculed 4 or 5 years ago. So it's difficult for me to see, is this the old neoliberal regime reestablishing itself, or is this actually something new?
Well, let's think about it in a wider global context. Let's think about actually the career of Joe Biden to begin with. So in the 1970s, he's elected in 1972, and he advocates a broadly Keynesian program that would see an expanded government. And that's what he's advocating in the 1970s. In the 1980s, the 1990s, he begins to advocate austerity programs. In the 2000s, he kind of gives a mixed response to the 2008 recession. On the one hand, he advocates countercyclical spending. On the other hand, he also is quite wary and keeps bringing up the budget deficit and other potential problems with overt government intervention in the economy. So there's a mixed response there. And now in 2020, he's advocating quite strong government stimulus. He's advocating the expansion of certain programs. So if you actually take aside the figure of Joe Biden, what I described is the arc of just about any centrist or center-left politician in the last 40, 50 years, from advocating quite liberal fiscal policies, or liberal in the American sense, I guess anything but liberal in other senses, Keynesian fiscal responses in the 1970s, to advocating belt tightening in the decades that followed, to advocating now more expansionary policies. So I think Biden is at the political level something of a bellwether. He certainly is a figure that reflects change in the Democratic Party, but I think he's also reflecting now changes in broadly the elite response to this current crisis. And I think whereas the elite consensus around the crisis of the 1970s was that this was a crisis born out of the excess power of working people, the excess power of unions, the state overreach and other problems, fueling both economic stagnation and also rising inflation. I think now the consensus is rightly that the real danger isn't an overheated economy, but the real danger is not enough consumer demand because of the crisis and other problems that can be solved by government stimulus. So I think it really is a reflection of the times rather than any ideological push, though certainly there's also the political dimension that for the first time in generations, you actually have a visible, pronounced political left in the United States. You have figures like Bernie Sanders. You have this mass base of young people around the Democratic Party pushing for a lot of these policies.
So how do you, as an American socialist, relate to this government? I mean, he's been very friendly to Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders even called him his friend. And they made these policy groups after the primaries, and it was obvious that he wanted some kind of an alliance with the youth base that you're referring to, and Bernie Sanders. On the other hand, he obviously is not Bernie Sanders, and he's obviously not a socialist. So how do you relate to him from the day after tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that the American politics is quite difficult to translate to other contexts, in part because it's a presidential system without really a party structure in a traditional sense. So there's no way for Biden to enforce discipline. There's also, on the other hand, no way for a bloc of socialist congresspeople, for example, to enforce discipline on Biden. He has his own electoral mandate that's distinct from the mandate of his party or the mandate of its representatives. So I think that means that Bernie Sanders has decided that the best route for him to make change has been through this coalition with Biden, has been through trying to leverage his power and influence in American politics and use it to give himself very powerful budgetary positions in Congress. And also Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other members of the squad have been given preferential positions on certain committees and other things that actually decide a lot of the workings of the US Congress. Now, I think that strategy makes perfect sense for these figures in their conditions. I think for the socialist left, the extra parliamentary left, like myself, I don't think that we can pursue those strategies. Mind you, if I had a route to very quickly conceding on some issues, of which I have no power, to actually win something for working class people, of course I would take it. But I think fundamentally our goal and our mentality has to be, we are the member of a third pole of American politics. And we do not want to be associated with any future failings of the Biden administration. We can't be seen as needlessly obstructionist and needlessly hostile. We have to wait for Biden to actually do things worthy of hostility. in other words, in order to maintain popular support. But we need to maintain this independence from the center of politics. Otherwise, when Biden's administration inevitably disappoints, or if it disappoints, the anti-establishment energy would just float to the populist right. So I think we're playing an important role in opposition, creating a distinct profile for American democratic socialists that's namely rooted in our key signature demand, which is for Medicare for all, an American national health insurance system. And this is a demand that has the support by some Marxists, somewhere between 67 and 71% of the American people support this, but Joe Biden has not endorsed it. Trump and the Republican Party is adamantly against it too. So it's a perfect issue where we seem to have popular support, and we could stake our ground around issues like this, around a Green New Deal and other things, and continue to develop a distinct roster of politicians that are pushing for these things.
In your book, there are several great questions, and one of them is, in other words, can we make socialism 21st century Americanism without losing our soul in the process or dressing up like Paul Revere? And this, of course, is a great question. And I was wondering, if you look at the last two cycles, Bernie running against Hillary, forming this great movement, and now you have a broader support, broader base for and I think you've even passed 100,000 members of Socialists in America, the DSA. Mm-hmm. And do you see this as a step in the right direction? Do you have the feeling that with the Biden presidency, the prominent positions, after all, for Bernie Sanders and his commitments to some social reforms, do you see this as you are progressive?
Well, unlike in a novel, in real life, it's hard to know whether you're at the beginning, middle, or end of a story. And I think that when it comes to being a socialist in the United States, one tends towards pessimism. So you could say that there's been a cycle of protest that has opened up across the Anglo-American world, the US and the UK as well, in the past 10 years, beginning with the Occupy movement and the anti-austerity, anti-cuts movement in the UK at the beginning of the 2010s, then leading and culminating in the two runs of Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, respectively. It seems to me that without the galvanizing figure and without a large-scale national electoral campaigns to rally around, the left will only get weaker in the coming years. Obviously, I'm doing everything I can to prevent that analysis, my rather pessimistic analysis, from coming to pass. But I think it becomes very easy to get locked into a sectarian mindset that says we had 5,000 members 5 years ago, and now we have 100,000. So by that measure, 5 years from now, we'll have 5 million members. I don't think it actually, politics or life, unfortunately, works that way. So we need to figure out what's our opening. How do we create the conditions for a new wave of struggle, a new cycle of struggle? I think a lot of it will have to do with electoral campaigns, in part because in the United States, as in Europe and elsewhere, the battle of the left is not really the battle of how do we take the existing working class and the existing working class institutions and rally it towards our political ends, but rather it's a battle for class reformation. So in other words, the very basis of working class life and politics has been shattered by the last 30, 40 years. We need to figure out how to use our electoral campaigns to rebuild our unions, to rebuild civil society, to rebuild all these other things that will actually, in fact, make the next wave, the next generation of working class politics possible.
Looking at the election results, it's been surprising to me, though not as surprising as maybe it should be, that you've seen the energy in the Democratic Party has been on the left, and the inspiration has been on the left, the new ideas. But on the other hand, you see that the Democratic Party is increasingly becoming an upper class party, a party of the well-educated elites, and that Trump has even gained votes among the working class in America. And I think actually this time it's not as white as it was the last time. So it seems that during this increasing inequality that characterized America over the last 20 years, that he has actually gained support in the working class. Is there anything that you could learn from Donald Trump? Is there anything about the way he talks or the way he speaks? Or
So I think that for one thing, his gains among the working class, we should say, were relative, at least especially among Black and Latino working class people. There were relative gains there. I think what we can say is we can learn something on the radical left from the rhetoric of Joe Biden, if anything, and that Biden actually speaks in a rhetoric that is broadly progressive, but not alienating. He speaks, I think, in a way that makes his message more attractive to ordinary people without speaking in the kind of xenophobic or backwards terms of Trump. And I think the American people writ large are broadly progressive. So progressive on a host of economic egalitarian issues, but also progressive on issues like immigration and progressives on issues of race. They don't like the radical rhetoric, the rhetoric of open borders, the rhetoric of defund the police. And mind you, as a socialist, of course, in principle, I'm in favor of I believe in the free movement of people. But I'm just saying that if you look at the polling, in general, it's not like we have to pander to a center-right nationalist parochial group of people. We have to pander, at least in the US, to a group of people who say, yes, we want more immigrants are fine, but there should be some limits. Or, we need to retrain bad cops and we need to keep an eye out and really hold our police departments accountable. But we also still need lots of policing to address crime. That's a plank of addressing crime and whatever else. So we believe in LGBT equality, but quote unquote, leave us alone, right? You do your thing, we'll do our thing in a kind of libertarian sense, which is tremendous progress over social norms and views, even in the 1990s on immigration and a host of issues. The American people are more progressive now than they were in the 1990s. Now, I think what Trump has benefited from, first and foremost, is the extreme polarization of US politics. So you could literally run me as the Democratic Party candidate for president with all my views on the record, and I would get 46% of the vote. That's the bare minimum for what someone would get in the United States running as a member of two major parties. Then when you factor in the advantage of incumbency, the fact that incumbents tend to win re-election in the United States, you would then look at Trump's performance and say, well, it wasn't really that impressive in many ways. What is telling, though, is the Democratic Party coalition, which is increasingly rooted in, as you say, wealthier suburbs. So this presents major problems for the Democrats. One of them is practical from the standpoint of the US political system, which has a geographic bias. It is very difficult, not just because of the Electoral College, but because of the way our seats are divided up, to win supermajorities necessary to govern, and it does require a supermajority to govern in the United States, if you're heavily concentrated in urban areas and suburban areas. So even if the Democrats have a pathway to continually win the presidential election through the Electoral College, given the current configuration of the country, they don't have the pathway to win 60 Senate seats and to win a commanding majority in the House of Representatives. This despite winning the popular vote by large measures. So in other words, the US political system is so dysfunctional, you can't really skate by. And we're seeing the Democrats lean into the continued de-alignment of its working class base. So areas of the parties used to command from the 1930s to the 1980s, they no longer command. And instead of trying to address this problem, the US Democrats, the mainstream ones at least, just like European social democrats have said, we're going to look for votes in other places. We're going to look for votes among the wealthiest salaried professionals. We're going to look for votes among parts of the elite. We're going to look for votes in quote unquote cosmopolitan young, people in cities, immigrants and whatnot. And the irony is now we're seeing that because they have not formulated the type of a message that can appeal to white working class people, Black working class people and Latino working class people are not so different. And in fact, the lack of the economic egalitarian message is now hurting them in these other groups too. Trump, of course, is associated with this quite vehement racialized rhetoric. So it's no surprise that he can't win over that many Black workers or that many Latino workers. But disproportionately, these people are just going to stay at home in the future. Or perhaps we might have a Republican, a right populist come along who will actually govern competently, who will actually do some economic stimulus and create some job programs and use less racialized rhetoric. And then what we have an absolute disaster for both the liberals and the left in the United States. And I think that's a real danger that's becoming apparent.
So what specific policies would you imagine that Biden could suggest that would win the working class voters that Trump won the last time over? It seems that you actually could formulate some policies that would encompass the entire working class and that would also, to a certain extent, satisfy the standards of justice for the well-educated elites.
Well, I think that often on the left, both in the US and the European left, we focus a lot on this constructing policies, right? Whereas a lot of politics isn't just about constructing the right policies or platform, because in fact, Biden's platform on a host of issues was actually quite progressive on paper, but it's about making issues salient. So in other words, what do we have to do in American politics to make the most important issues, not this cultural issues or social issues, but make it about jobs, make it about wages, make it about healthcare, make it about all these other issues that we can outperform the right on. And I think that happens in part at the level of rhetoric. So Biden, in other words, had all these very, many of these, obviously not on healthcare or the Green New Deal, but many popular parts of his platform in there. He just didn't foreground it. He foregrounded himself as the respectable alternative to Donald Trump. He sometimes dabbled in more populist rhetoric. That definitely helped him in Pennsylvania, where he's from. It helped him in some parts of the upper Midwest, where even white working class voters seem to swing in the upper Midwest from Trump back to Biden. But the key is to not just push an economic egalitarian program, which is important, but also to make those economic issues more salient. And if the Democrats just want to talk about social issues, if they just want to talk about how racist or disgusting Trump is, then I don't see how they can compel people to vote. There's only so many people who will be compelled to vote in the negative to shield themselves from nightmares.
One issue that is not prevalent in your wonderful book, The Socialist Manifesto, that I would recommend to everyone following here, is climate change. And it appears that sometimes that climate change can be divisive on the left. That you say, well, the working class are not too preoccupied with climate. They want to protect their jobs in the oil industry, and they don't want to change their ways of living. Whereas the privileged on the left, they're very into climate change. I wonder how you see this dilemma with climate change and reaching out to working class voters.
Well, I think we need an ecological politics rooted in the working class. Otherwise, we won't have a successful ecological politics. So I think that climate change is the most existential issue facing human civilization. I think that, in fact, it's an existential crisis for the left in particular, because if you look back at the history of the left, the history from the time that the modern workers movement was founded in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, in that era to today, you would actually see that the history of organized socialist politics, the history of working class politics, has been a history of success. We went from conditions of extreme precarity, where people were being hoarded from the countryside into packed factories, working 12, 13-hour shifts, living in slums, often without any democratic rights at all, without ever having seen a doctor in their lives, dying in their 40s or early 50s. You know, this was the norm for being working class. And even in a country like the United States, we've developed and we fought for expansions of suffrage. We fought for a 8-hour day. We fought for all these other progressive taxation, all these other things that the state's doing, which would have been unimaginable in the 19th century, and all of which came from pressure from working class politics. And in a way, I have supreme confidence that given enough time, we will manage to bring about a more egalitarian society. We will manage to create out of all this abundance that we have, the end to human misery. But that all is predicated on not having both the material dimensions of a kind of regression to a worse form of civilization, a barbarism, because of climate change, and also because the dynamics of climate change in its early stages, which will mean mass exoduses of refugees from coastal areas like Bangladesh, like inland, from sub-Saharan Africa, upward, and so on, will create a tremendous backlash from the right. You know, if there was such a crisis and such debates and such right-wing fear-mongering over the amount of refugees we saw during the Syrian civil war, you can imagine what we'll see in the years to come. So obviously, I think it's very important. But the key is to not counterpose any of those demands with day-to-day lives of working people. So I think we need a left that's still pro-growth. I think we need a left that transitions away from fossil fuels as we can, but also is realistic that, of course, we'll continue need to extract some fossil fuels in the foreseeable future, like plastics, and there's all sorts of materials that we rely on. Even fracking, our need for forms of fracking for new forms of clean energy, not just for gas production. Nuclear power, I think, is a necessity for us to maintain existing stocks of nuclear power plants. And in this moment, while we obviously await a expansion of renewable energy and also a renewable energy technology to develop to the point that something like solar or wind can form a stable baseload, which right now it cannot. So I think we need, in other words, a left that doesn't counterpose jobs to these things and doesn't ask individual people for austerity, because it's not just in the global north. Yes, perhaps those of us living middle-class lifestyles in the global north don't need to consume more. We need to consume better, right? Like a better quality of things. But there's a lot of people around the world who are suffering and do need more. I spent a few summers ago in Delhi all summer long. And the people of Delhi, India, need air conditioning. It's a necessity. It's a basic of life in that climate in the summer, where laborers die of heat stroke every day. And I think it is the condition of much of the world that is still underdeveloped and poverty, and this will be solved by economic growth and full employment policies that utilizes all the resources of the planet in a sustainable way to create more plenty. And I think this is an argument, a point, a way of framing things that would not have been controversial for much of the first 160 years of the modern left, and it shouldn't be in the future. And that's the only way that we could solve climate change and push for the kind of state investment and state action it will take to solve climate change. It will require building and mobilizing working class people, and also pointing out how the objectives of individual capitalists are always short-termist. in the sense that they don't act collectively, they act to just secure their bottom line and to maintain their market competitiveness. So obviously, this requires working class wielding of the state. Obviously, I think in the long run, it requires socialism, but we won't win socialism in the next 10, 15 years, and we'll need to address climate change before we enter into a point of no return with feedback loops, which I think we will enter, very soon, unless we use the carrot and sticks available to us through our existing governments.
Well, thank you. I want to turn the attention to a few themes of your book. Here we only have 15 minutes left. First, when you started speaking about socialism in America here in the 21st century, I think people were very enthusiastic. In Denmark, it was like the taboo was down. The socialists were no longer the losers of the Cold War. It was like, let's reopen the imagination. Let's think about politics again. And it's kind of a paradox that you have inspired the left wing here in Denmark with talking about socialism in America. But then when you see the policies suggested by Bernie, they resemble very much the social democratic policies of Denmark. And he mentions Franklin D. Roosevelt as kind of a role model for socialism and the New Deal reforms. And where very often I come to wonder what is actually the difference between what you call socialism and then social democracy. I know it's a big question and you have lengthy reflections on it in your book, but I'm curious to hear your short answer.
Yeah, well, I think that the goal, well, first of all, part of the goal of my book was to integrate the social democratic tradition back within this wider socialist tradition. So I think it was absurd that socialists in the United States were more interested in what happened in Russia in 1917 than what happened in Sweden in 1971, because I think they both fell short of their goals. But I think the case of Nordic social democracy was more instructive to our moment for obvious reasons. I think that the pursuit of social democracy, and by that I mean the pursuit of a social democracy that's rooted in working class power, not just rooted in corporatist compromise, but pushed by a party with a transformative agenda, with the backing of working class people in an organized fashion through trade unions and other organs. This is a social democracy whose logic could possibly lead to democratic socialism. So, in other words, I think if you look at the experience of, let's say, Sweden from 1968 to 1977, 1978, you would say that the experience of social democracy, far from making people pliant and satisfied with capitalism, actually opened up for capitalists a Pandora's box, where in order to resolve the crises that social democracy unleashed in the 1970s, the left wing of social democracy began pushing for wage earner funds, began pushing for new forms of industrial democracy. Militancy exploded in social democracies. And it seems to me that if there was ever a viable route to socialism in a parliamentary, democratic context, that was it. And it seems to me that today, in the pursuit of a more robust, responsive state, in the pursuit of working class parties and institutions, our short-term agenda will obviously be the social democratic reforms. But this doesn't foreclose the possibility of socialism. In fact, I think it's a prerequisite for thinking beyond social democracy itself.
What do you think was the effect of Bernie Sanders calling himself a socialist? Because if you look at the surveys, there's a huge support for many of his proposals. That, like, many Republican voters would support some of his proposals that you could label radical. And I, of course, understand that calling himself a socialist was inspiring and mobilizing, and it inspired us here as well. But on the other hand, I thought maybe he would have won the primaries if he didn't call himself a socialist, because some of the elite Democrats were afraid that the others would be afraid of a self-proclaimed socialist. What did the label do to Bernie?
Well, I think Bernie Sanders didn't have much of a choice in that he was a socialist. He first became politicized in the Young People's Socialist League, which was our youth section of the old Socialist Party of America, of Eugene Debs and Norm Thomas and these other figures. He had, throughout his political career, from his early races in Vermont onward, called himself a socialist. So, I think that he didn't have a choice but to say who he was. I also think in the U.S. context, they would call you a socialist anyway. The red baiting would happen anyway. And I think at this point, the socialist label is neither a benefit nor a harm. I think it fundamentally means very little to people. Most people associated with Nordic welfare states, to the extent they have association. I think that we need to actually win something for our politics to have any sort of deeper resonance. For now, just a floating, signifier almost. So fundamentally, I think that Bernie Sanders calling himself a socialist was less important than the egalitarian program behind him. Obviously, I'm among the very small group of Americans that became politicized with the language and history of socialism. I became politicized in the Young Democratic Socialists of America when I was just a teenager. The Young Democratic Socialists of America is obviously tied to DSA. DSA was for a very long time the only American affiliate of the Socialist International at the time when, Ola Palma and others were major figures. So we were probably more schooled in the traditions of European social democracy, particularly its left wing at the 1970s. Than other American socialists. So I have this unusual background. It might be that in the future that this economic egalitarian rhetoric finds firmest ground on US soil with a left populist rhetoric, perhaps. Populism as a modern political movement actually emerged in the United States amongst our poor farmers and workers in the late 19th century. We invented the populist movement. It might be that in the future we'll reinvent it from the left. I can't say that for certain, but I think what's less important is the rhetoric. What's more important is the program and actually. I guess rhetoric too, because actually conveying that program in such a way that doesn't alienate people.
When I was in New Hampshire with my son, who's a great Bernie Sanders fan, to see him win there it's about a year ago now. And at that time, I'm not an American, so I don't understand politics the way you do. But I thought he was winning, Bernie. I had the sensation that he was building this very strong movement and that the establishment, they couldn't coalesce against him. And so I thought it seemed to me that he was winning. There was so much self-confidence among his supporters, and his intensity seemed to meet the moment. And what is your explanation today why Bernie Sanders didn't win?
Well, I think fundamentally, it's worth remembering that Bernie Sanders was running in a crowded field of almost a dozen Democratic Party contenders, and he finished second in this field. So I think it's worth saying what differentiated Bernie from the rest of the Democratic field. That's one thing. Why didn't Bernie win? Well, I think that he had an uphill battle to begin with. Fundamentally, most Democrats, after the experience of Donald Trump, didn't want radical change or rupture or a political revolution. They wanted to return to normalcy. Biden benefited from perceptions of electability. People thought that he was the best bet to defeat Donald Trump. Bernie Sanders, I believe, should have ran on the idea that only he could defeat Donald Trump. Obviously, even though we know that's not the case, he should have ran on the case that Biden is Hillary Clinton 2.0. We've already tried this. We already tried the safe bet. Only my brand of left kind of firebrand politics can defeat Donald Trump. I think he should have ran on that. He should have called into more doubt the ability of Biden to protect Medicare and Social Security. I think he ran a campaign that included some of those elements, but it was a little bit too confused. And it also became I think too much like a recipe list, like a wish list. I think you especially had this with Corbyn. Corbyn was going to give you everything. And then at some point, if you say you're going to give people everything, they think you're going to give them nothing. And there was a line, I think it was from Tony Blair, actually, and maybe this we can learn from New Labour, if it was indeed Blair who said this, maybe it was Kinnock or someone else, that your party platform should be able to fit on the back of your membership card, your party card. And I think, in other words, we need message discipline on the left. We need our candidates to be as repetitive as Bernie, but Bernie was told that he had to address every single issue under the sun. We should have just said, Bernie, just say Medicare for all, just say jobs, just say trade. And I think that the campaign became too expansive about too many things and promised too many things, though I honestly do believe we could have delivered on those many of those promises. But I think that was a real danger more than anything else. But Biden was a very strong candidate in the end. He was a candidate that I think rhetorically has a lot in common with Bernie Sanders at the level of being able to relate to and connect to ordinary voters in a way that wasn't off-putting, in a way that didn't use complex vocabulary. You had Democratic Party candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Julian Castro literally using the academic rhetoric of intersectionality in their campaign. Rhetoric that might give them a splash in the media and among a very small, narrow layer of highly educated professionals, but among most Democratic Party voters, really just as meaningless. And the last thing I would say is that it's worth remembering that we exist as political people in a universe that is highly polarized. And obviously American politics is becoming very polarized too. But within the Democratic Party, most Democrats liked all their choices. So what's unusual to think of is that there's a huge portion of the Democratic Party that was number one, Joe Biden, number two, Bernie Sanders, or vice versa. So Bernie had to be careful at all times to not wage too aggressive of a campaign against Joe Biden, because within the Democratic Party, unlike within the Republican Party, I think some of the rhetoric of hostility that Trump displayed to his Republican opponents would not have flied within the Democratic Party. My own parents, for instance, voted for Bernie Sanders, but really liked Joe Biden. That is the norm within the Democratic Party. You will never find someone on Twitter who cares about politics who is a Biden, a Bernie guy, but it's very common out there, especially among people of color and other Democratic Party loyalists. They like their party.
I have one last question for you, because your book came out in 2019. I think you must have worked on it for a long time, because it's very extensive. But one of the heroes of the book is Jeremy Corbyn, and after your book came out and it was finished, he lost an election that probably he could have won, but he never delivered a solution to the problem of Brexit. This issue that was the burning issue for his country, he never gave an answer to what to do about Brexit. And for me, that was like a classical left-wing fallacy, that you had your own problems that you wanted to talk about, and you did not want to talk about the other problem. And then there was this issue that a candidate running against racism as an anti-racist candidate, he did not want to take responsibility for the anti-Semitism in his own party. How do you see the legacy of Corbyn?
Well, two things. Well, I think for one thing, there, of course, is lots of anti-Semitism in British society, including the Labour Party, because there's just lots of anti-Semitism in British society. I don't think there was any structural or institutional or systemic anti-Semitism within the UK Labour Party. I think, if anything, it was closer to a moral panic. And we've seen lots of these moral panics crop up around issues of oppression. And because the oppression actually exists in the world, it becomes very difficult to delineate between what's a media event and what's a panic. But I think in this case, it certainly is a scourge that should be confronted. He certainly had some rhetorical things that he should have change. So, for example, if you're addressing the issue of anti-Semitism, there's no need to say you condemn all forms of racism and anti-Semitism too. You could just say you condemn anti-Semitism in that context. So there's little things like that where I think he felt the need to hedge and say other things. I think there's a tradition, in particular the UK, of anti-Semitism, which is quite more virulent than in some other parts of the Anglophone world. I think the irony is that it's been deepest and most entrenched in the British elite. Unlike in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, I would say anti-Semitism in the UK has a more elite than plebeian roots, but that's another story. On the issue of Brexit, I really do think that in part tanked his campaign because he embraced this, in the end, essentially a people's vote position after resisting it for so long. Now, putting aside what you think about Brexit, my own view is somewhat nuanced, which is that I think the process of European integration was a process that hurt the prospects for social democracy in a place like the United Kingdom. There's a reason why the Bennites and the Labour left resisted European integration, but the Brexit campaign was a campaign fueled and led by the right wing of British society. I think it would be very hard to support a campaign like that, even if you like some of the policy outcomes. I also think that the UK might have been a little bit too far down the road of European integration in a highly financialized economy for it to make much economic sense either. But that's kind of another story. But his position during the referendum, I think, was correct, which is that he hedged and he was fairly neutral. And the reason to be neutral, while at least saying you support a Remain vote, but not really campaigning on it that hard, was because in the heartland of Labour voters, these were loyal Labour voters who were also Leave voters, or many of them were Leave voters. So why alienate those voters? Then at that point, once Brexit is done, once the vote is concluded, you have a democratic mandate to leave the European Union. The response of Corbyn in 2017 in that environment was essentially that everyone took for granted that the Brexit mandate would be followed through upon. But in part because of the actions of Labour Party activists, among other parts of UK civil society, the fact that there would be a Brexit was cast into doubt in the lead up to 2019. So obviously, I think he should have done what he could to suppress those currents in the lead up to the UK election. I think also one lesson that we can learn from Corbyn that I think all center-left parties across Europe and the world need to understand is that it is better to lose one election and maintain your historic base than to try to gamble to win over new voters and lose your base. So, for example, the strategy pushed by some parts of the Labour Party that Corbyn seemed to go along with in the last few months of the election said, let's pivot to the south of England. Let's pivot to these new voters, these new constituencies. We hope we'll keep our voters. We hope that they'll stick with us, but we're going to pivot our rhetoric to winning over these new areas in the south of England. I think a more conservative campaign aimed at preserving Labour Party strength and aimed towards its historic voters in Wales, in the north of England, in the Midlands, and elsewhere would have been far more effective. But in either case, I think this is no big indictment on the prospects for a renewed social democracy in the Labour Party. Practically, they've been defeated, but at no point was Corbyn's program defeated. We perhaps in Corbyn did not have the best ambassador in the sense that I think Corbyn was a incredibly strong moral figure of authority, but not the best politician in the sense of being able to discipline his own party. I think the Labour left lost a massive opportunity to restructure the party at the CLP, the constituency Labour Party level. They could have really recreated the Labour Party into a vehicle of working class politics. But the big irony that I see in this whole experience is that if you look at what the historic project of third way social democracy was, of New Labour, this was to reorient Labour from its traditional base in the manual working class to a younger, more cosmopolitan, more dynamic base that included lots of salaried professionals. And in the end, it took a Bennite committed to the restoration of a socialist Labor Party to, in the effect, I think by accident, if you look at where Labor won, where they lost, to essentially make the map look kind of like the map that Blair wanted. I think the difference is Blair also and Kinnock assumed that they would win Scotland. And the fact that Scottish nationalism is still growing will make it very difficult for Labour to win and govern in the future. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of lessons. I'm not sure, again, that it's a big indictment. Like a lot of people ask me, I know this wasn't your question, they asked me, well, isn't Corbyn's loss an indictment on democratic socialism? Well, socialism have seen plenty of defeats over the past, 120 years, plenty of crimes committed in its names and whatnot. Like, I don't think Jeremy Corbyn is going to rank very high, among them.
Well, thank you so very much for taking your time and talking to us. And I'll recommend your book, The Socialist Manifesto, to everyone following us here. And I'll also recommend following Jacobin and reading your analysis of what's taking place and everything that's going on. Thank you. It's been very inspirational. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.